next speaker is Dr. Anders Sandberg. It's my pleasure to introduce him. Anders is a neuroscientist, but he's also a polymath. He's someone who not only writes about ethics, existential risk, the future of humanity, but also can do incredible graphic designs. And that is impressive in my view, because he crosses the line between that hard science and the soft science. And plus he's an incredible humanitarian and more importantly, a trans-humanitarian. He's a debater. And if you're ever in a debate with Anders, you'll find that you'll be arguing and laughing simultaneously because he has this incredible sense of humor. He is a senior fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute located at Oxford University in England. His essays have been published in numerous academic journals on artificial intelligence, ethics, existential risk, and again, a true polymath. It's my pleasure to welcome Anders Sandberg. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm going to try to follow these kind introductions that are, of course, overly expanding what I can do. And I'm going to talk about a slightly annoying topic, a topic that we probably have heard far too much about. And that is, of course, pandemics. Now, I'm going to ask the question, when will we get to the last one? When will we actually end up with a pandemic-free world? So, as I said, we're all really tired of pandemics, and they have been with us far too long. Indeed, it turns out that probably illnesses are probably older than bacteria. The reason is that bacteriophages, viruses that attack single-celled organisms, seem to have emerged, at least according to some evolutionary models, before the bacteria branched off from our own branch, the eukaryotes. That was several billion years ago. And since then, Earth's biosphere have been struggling with the problem that cells get infected by selfish replicators that try to take the resources and use them for their own purposes. Evolution is really opportunistic, and what survives to replicate, well, that becomes more common, no matter how painful, nasty, or annoying it is. So we're living in this world full of selfish genes that produce selfish replicators. In some cases, this selfishness produces awesome and beautiful results. After all, most of the biosphere has been created through this selfish process. And even the yucky parasites are in many cases quite useful. The reason is that they, to some degree, actually regulate ecological pathways. Parasites reduce reproduction rates in a rather soft manner. It's very different from predator-prey situations like rabbits and foxes, where you quite often get oscillations because of this. Unfortunately, many pathogens, like especially epidemic disease, also cause this kind of oscillations, which can be rather bad, not just for the victims, but also, of course, for the pathogen, because they might run out of hosts to infect. Now, we humans, we have a paradoxical situation. In many ways, we suffer more than many other species. And this is partially because we have such a large population. We have been so successful that we're the most common large mammal of our size class on Earth, besides our own domestic animals, which means that there's a lot of humans to infect, a lot of potential mutations happening. And indeed, we are also suffering from relatively low genetic diversity. Many other species have much more genetic diversity and diseases can't propagate quite as well. We also have a dense social graph. We're really social creatures. We love each other. We love to get close to each other. We love to talk. We love to travel across the world. And that, of course, means that we can transmit pathogens really, really well. And we exist in practically all biotopes, which means that we're getting close to all sorts of organisms that might have some pathogen that would like to jump and get into the human world. On the other hand, we also have a wonderful ability that no other species on the planet has. We are aware of the problem. We know we have a problem here. What is going on is basically that we are not just intelligent conceptualizers thinking about the world in a different abstract manner, but also that we got a cumulative culture. We pick up on what's going on around us, tell stories about it, and if they're really good stories, they get told to new generations. We figure out a good way of making stone axes, and then we teach it to our children. We figure out the germ theory of disease, and we teach it at school. We figure out solutions, which means that we invented quarantine. We invented hygiene. We have invented scientific medicine, which over the past few centuries has done an enormous difference. So we are in an interesting situation here. Now, there is one possibility, of course, that we could get a last pandemic in the bad way. It turns out that natural pandemics can lead to extinction, but is relatively rare. The reason is, of course, that if there are few hosts left, the pathogen can't survive on its own. So generally, when the number of hosts go down, the pathogen is out of luck, the epidemic stops. Indeed, there is quite often a co-evolution of virulence. When syphilis crossed the Atlantic back in the old days to Europe, it was a deadly disease. And then it became less and less deadly because people who were deathly sick didn't have that much sex, so they couldn't spread their brand of syphilis bacteria. Excuse me. I have some bacteria in my throat who are now desperately trying to jump ship, and they're not doing a very good job of it because we can't get across Zoom to you. The problem is, of course, suppose there was a vector that could. In that case, even if I was deathly sick, they could cross using that vector, let's say a mosquito. And at that point, they could infect you. And there was no incentive for them to become less virulent. So while the common cold is behaving rather nicely, that is because it benefits from not being deadly. While Ebola has not been around humans very long, and I think COVID-19 also has the same trademark, it's going to become nicer in a few decades. But that might be too long for us to wait. And this is, of course, how you can get into real problem if you're encountering a new disease or it has a vector. The reason I got a frog there is that right now many amphibians are threatened by extinction because of a fungal disease, the chytrid fungus, which unfortunately also partially infects toads, and they don't get sick. And what happens is basically that the toads then act as vectors to various frog species who really croak. Sorry for the pun, I couldn't resist. Now, could this happen to us? Well, the Black Plague demonstrates that sometimes you can get some very nasty diseases, but we have survived that one. Indeed, it seems unlikely that most natural diseases could cause us to die out. The problem is, of course, that, well, humans might actually make new diseases. And we might be unlucky. Maybe there is some very, very common little vector out there that could act as a host for a really deadly pathogen. But most likely, we're not going to get done in by a pandemic this way. So, what can we do to stop pandemics? Actually, asking what would it be like to win the war on pandemics, I think, is actually a quite useful question. Normally, we just struggle to survive and deal with what we got. But what if I had a grand strategy? What do we actually want to make sure we got rid of it? So the complicated diagram I'm showing is from a paper I wrote together with some of my colleagues at the Future of Humanity Institute a few years back. We were thinking about existential risks and what would it take for a risk to wipe us out? Well, basically, we need to fail at avoiding it. And when it happens, we need to fail at responding to it. And then we need to fail at enduring the damage. Now, the earlier you can stop this process, the better. And indeed, if we can just make sure that we can withstand pandemics by having some immune people or people living apart, that's great, but it's not great for most of us because we would be wiped out. So we want to have a better response process, or even better, a very good avoidance mechanism. But generally, pandemics are a good example of what we call a cascading risk. It's a small thing, but it spreads exponentially. That means that at first it moves slowly and then it moves fast. And this is where transhumanists have this advantage. We have naturally a tendency to think about exponential growth and realize that, yeah, just because it's slow right now doesn't mean it's not going to be dramatic, earth-shattering later. We need to act quickly here. It's also often concealed. Pathogens are small, tiny, nasty things. If it was very obvious who was infected, it would be easy to avoid it. And that suggests that improving detection capabilities is important. Also, in this diagram, I point out impeding cooperation is really a big problem. When we don't cooperate against a shared global risk, things fail. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that very clearly. On the left side, so far we only have had natural pandemics, but I think we should make sure to be ready if there was one that occurred, either because of malicious risk or just because of an accident with gain of function research done for good reasons to try to figure out how to prevent future pandemics, but maybe done in a sloppy way. We also have a fair bit of commons risk. We have set up a world in a way that is a bit fragile. We need to improve our global system for this. And you might say as a slogan that we want to have a global system that is tight in fixing problems, but kind of loose in spreading the problems. If there is a problem somewhere, we can isolate the problem and make sure it doesn't spread. But we want to spread the knowledge of how to fix the problem really well. So let's imagine that we're going to try to win the war against disease. How would that look? Well, short term, we should, of course, eradicate the diseases we can eradicate. It turns out that it worked for smallpox and rinderpest. Right now, there are ongoing efforts to get rid of polio, yaws, guinea worm, and malaria. Some of them have gone further than others. We're getting there, but we need a lot of hard work, and there have been some big setbacks. There are some potential diseases like measles, mumps, and systemic sarcosis that could do it. And this works for some diseases. Diseases we can detect, diseases we can easily isolate if we find somebody that got it, especially if we can make vaccines, and there shouldn't be a reservoir out there in the wild. So this is not going to work for other coronaviruses or bird flu because, well, there is a lot of bird flus out among the birds, and we can't get rid of all the birds. We might want to get rid of the malaria mosquito, but I don't think we want to get rid of birds. That would be a fairly bad idea. We might also want to avoid evolutionary outflanking. Antibiotic resistance is a problem, even for things like flu pandemics. One of the deadly effects of having flu, especially in elderly people, is pneumonia. And if antibiotic-resistant pneumonia became common, then the flu would actually become deadlier. So that yellow part of that diagram, of course, of untimely death, that's the one we want to get rid of. And we have various tools for it. We probably need to develop broader antibiotics. We need to figure out a way of managing virulence of evolving diseases. And there might be ways of not getting rid of a disease, but making it milder. And we need to generally improve public health. And this involves simple things like sanitations, has worked wonders, even without any germ theory. Being able to do social distancing has been really helped in developed countries because of things like Amazon and the delivery services and the internet. 10 years ago, COVID would have been a much worse epidemic. Unfortunately, social distancing, like we are doing it in Europe and the US, doesn't work in developing countries like India. Day laborers actually need to make the day's labor in order to get money so they can feed their family. We need to figure out a way around that and make that economy able to, when needed, do social distancing. And then, of course, anti-aging is also pro-immune system. If we were to solve and fix aging, a lot of the pink stuff, the non-communicable chronic diseases, would disappear. But it will also help against the infectious ones. This is stuff people are already working on, but I think we can push it onwards. We just need to make use of the momentum we're getting from the pandemic. Midterm, things get more interesting, I think, from a transhumanist perspective. The most obvious thing is we need a global emerging pathogen surveillance system. When something pops up, we need to detect it really quickly. So right now we have some methods of taking in random samples, sequencing them, and trying to compare to genomes. This is right now a little bit too scattershot approach. But you have a lot of false positives. You get the most crazy things if you just look at the New York subway using this method, and most of them are false positives. For example, you find armadillo genomes in the New York subway. There are probably no armadillos in the New York subway, but that shows that we need to fix the false positives. We also need to be able to detect entirely new pathogens and notice that they're risky. That is probably going to require biosimulation, but we actually can run models that if this organism showed up, what would it do in the body? Does this look scary, even if we've never seen it before? That is also useful for trying to figure out quick responses. Because if there is one important lesson from pandemics and most rare events, is that we cannot predict when they will happen. But if we react quickly, we can actually do quite a lot of good against them. Now, the interesting part here is that what happens is that rapid response sometimes is going to be a false positive. But that's okay. We want to pay that price. But we also need to have a fairly effective response. It turns out for COVID, it was early response was more important than what you did, as long as you did some social distancing and reducing reproduction number. If we want to have a rapid intervention, we might want to manufacture antibodies, a massive scale. You want to take a genome, you want to figure out how to make antibodies against the proteins being generated there, simulate that we don't do anything bad in the body, and then test it, and then send it out to bioprinters around the world to make immunizations very quickly. This is an interesting challenge because it's going to require some very new methods. We actually need to figure out how to set up entirely new forms of institutions and the biosafety. It also fits into the question about artificial intelligence and machine learning. How well can we use them to simulate better? Anyway, I'm running out of time, so I should also mention that we need infrastructure for biosafety because all of this biotech is going to be risky. And in the long run, that is hopefully just a few decades, we're going to get nanomedicine, which is important because we might be using systems that are not biological to control biological systems in a much more elaborate form. I have a picture there of Robert Freitas' respirocytes, because I couldn't find a good picture of his idea of vasculoid, replacing literally the blood system with a kind of railway system for transporting nutrient, oxygen, and immune cells. If we had that one, COVID would probably have a hard time actually getting around in the body. Many diseases would simply not work because we would be incompatible and too much of a cyborg. There are other ways of making us incompatible with biology that might be powerful. These ones seem to be natural results of various forms of enhancement. Long term, of course, we might go even further. I've been working on brain emulation. What if we actually scanned our brains and replicated them in computers? Leaving aside a big philosophical debate about personal identity, consciousness, etc., existing as software means that at least you're not going to get the common cold. You're going to be immune to all the biological pathogens. You also are going to have a lot of other advantages, like being able to make backups, etc. We might also say we should go to space, not just because space is the place and there is so much resources and potential freedom, but also it's a natural quarantine. If we were to spread across the solar system, different habitats would actually naturally act as quarantines for each other. The travel times, even with really good nuclear rockets, might actually be limited. So this sounds good. But there is this little problem. This might be the end game. This might be indeed a world where we might be immortal and be very close to the World Health Organization story. But I think we're still not going to be completely winning against disease, because there is a fundamental problem here. And that is evolution creates new diversity, emergent systems of all kinds, and some of them are going to replicate. In order to get rid of this, we actually need to stop emergent evolving replicators. And that happens in our minds. Memes are replicators too. There are bad, dangerous memes. There are bad people. Indeed, if you look at the world, most genomes belong to a virus. Most part of our own genome are selfish genes that copy themselves somewhat stupidly. And biology is by its nature insecure. We could imagine making a secure biology, essentially locking it down, so only genes that were cryptographically secure could be executed and make sure no virus got in. That would end natural evolution, and maybe that's a good thing. It still sounds a little bit rigid. We might want this for our computers, but maybe not for a garden. And would we want it for our minds? The problem is, of course, a world where information can be revoked, which is necessary for a mimetic anti-pandemic infrastructure, is probably a bit too much. So it might be that we can overcome pandemics. It looks like there is potentially a technology that could make a certain pandemic the last pandemic ever. But I don't think we're ever going to get rid of disease, awkwardness, biology, embodiment, and that thing. But that's kind of fun. because there are many other things that are worthwhile. We can compartmentalize our world, making sure that certain things don't spread. We can build fast response. We can make a backup system. We can build collective immune systems and higher order control of our biology. We can coordinate better. Indeed, we must coordinate better. Our non-biological cleverness can trump biology. So the quote I got here is from Sir William Petty, who after the great plague in London did a model of how big is the next plague in London going to be. And I'm happy to say that he was so far wrong. Why? Because there wasn't one. Sanitation got better. They rebuilt after the plague and the fire, and that actually helped making a better world. Let's make sure that we continue that and make sure that there is going to be a last pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders. Thank you for your talk, and thank you for keeping your time right and being very respectful towards the other speakers. I do have plenty of questions, so I have the hard job to select only the one that we have time to answer. So let's start with a question asked by Matt. Are you worried about CRISPR's potential to make it easier for rogue actors to engineer pandemics?
Yes, to some extent. So I have a little paper out where I was looking at what I call the risk pipeline. For somebody with a bad intention to cause damage in the world, they need to jump through a number of hoops. They need to come up with some nasty genome. They need to turn that into an actual genome. They need to put it into an organism. They need to multiply the organism. They need to spread it, etc. And each of these steps are tricky, which means that they're filtering out a lot of bad actors. But if the chain gets shorter or if the steps get easier, it becomes easier to get past. So we might want to figure out ways of having the lab infrastructure being safer. We want probably to make sure that biolabs should be able to print out any genome, but you log very carefully what genome was done, by whom, and when, etc. You want to have accountability and traceability. I think CRISPR is just the first of a lot of other technologies, and we need something that is helpful against most of them.
Yep. Next question comes from Richard. How does the chance of multiple overlapping pandemics influence the action needed to mitigate the threats? Does it make them exponentially harder to address as the linear numbers of threats increase?
Well, it depends a bit on the kind of pandemic. So right now, I heard some disturbing news about a new possible influenza virus, for example. But suppose it was a pandemic influenza and it's occurring right now where we are trying to deal with COVID. What should we do differently? Actually, not very much. We should just be wearing even more masks, doing even more social distancing. We just need to check for extra diseases. In that case, the two pandemics are actually kind of tripping each other up because we're too similar. I would be really worried about one pandemic that was very dissimilar from another pandemic happening at the same time. This is where we actually need to recognize we need to be able to think several things at the same time. Just because we're having a big discourse right now about racism and police brutality doesn't mean we're not also having to deal with the pandemic, as well as questions about online privacy and what to do about Hong Kong, etc., etc. And similarly, we need to be able to juggle multiple pandemics because there is always going on stuff in the world. It's parallel, which is so annoying, but also makes it worth living in.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's been very enlightening and everyone loved it. So
Thank you.
We might see you back for your panel. Thank you so much.